This show will make news. I challenge YouTube to take this show off your site, off your platform, because on this show, you're going to hear a very distinguished person violate your standards by saying and suggesting that, quote, widespread fraud or errors change the outcome of the 2020 election. You're going to hear somebody say that, and you're going to hear me challenge YouTube to take my channel off the air, because YouTube has announced that anybody who makes that statement will be censored and denied the opportunity to reach the YouTube audience. So listen to the Dershow for this challenge. Today's Dershow is going to make news. We are going to challenge YouTube to take this show down. YouTube yesterday announced outrageously that it will take down any videos, any audios, anything on its platform that, quote, misleads people by alleging that widespread fraud or errors change the outcome of the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Can you imagine anything more inconsistent with the spirit and culture of the First Amendment than to stop a debate about a presidential election? There are tens of millions of people out there who, whether correctly or incorrectly, honestly believe that this election was changed by errors, at least errors. Some believe fraud, some believe systematic fraud, some believe just errors, some believe the misuse of a machine. There are all kinds of arguments out there. There are cases now pending. There is a case now pending where a United States state, the state of Texas, is suing other states with the support of a handful of yet other states, claiming this. And YouTube will take it down, won't even allow us to debate it and discuss it. Well, YouTube, we're going to debate it and discuss it today on the Dershow. I have a great guest, one of my best students ever, and he has just turned into a remarkable young man who has, young by comparison to me, everybody's young by comparison to me, but he's really young, has had a remarkable career from South Africa to the United States. Amazing, amazing young man. I have to take credit. I spotted him very early in his career at Harvard Law School, and I was privileged to have him in my class on legal ethics, where he sat in the front row and had his hand up quite a bit, and has moved on to a great career at Breitbart. We don't agree politically. He's a conservative Republican. I'm a liberal Democrat. We fight, but in a friendly way, always. We disagree about some values. We agree about core values of free speech and due process. He's written a great book. You can get it on Kindle for a couple of bucks. It's cheap as could be. And you should buy it immediately. The great book is called Neither Free Nor Fair, the 2020 Election. And get it on Kindle. And you know, he's not the first person to write a book challenging an election. I wrote a book in 2000 challenging the 2000 election. I called it Supreme Injustice. I wonder whether if YouTube were around then they would have taken down my book or taken down my advocacy, in which I claimed that the 2000 election was stolen from Al Gore by the United States Supreme Court. And I used pretty immoderate language going after my friend Antonin Scalia and some of the other justices. But now I want to turn to Joel. I want to talk to him for a few minutes about his book, to encourage all of you to read it. Then I want to ask him to state categorically the criteria that YouTube said would require the taking down of a video or an audio. So, Joel, welcome to the Dershow. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be able to talk about this topic at a very timely moment.
Yeah.
The book, the book Neither Free Nor Fair talks about voter fraud, but it also pulls the lens back, and I zoom out and look at the election as a whole, because, of course, voting and counting votes, those are the most important things that happen in an election, but they're the last things. And an election is a long process, and there's an international standard for evaluating whether an election is free and fair. And it's my argument in this book that we have actually fallen far short of that standard in the 2020 election.
Have we ever had a fair and free election in the United States under your standards?
We have. Although I point out in the book that claims of voter fraud and rigging have been increasing over the last 2 decades. There's almost no election in the last 2 decades that has not been greeted by protest over potential shenanigans, starting really with the recount in 2000, as you know, and you were very much a part of it.
I was part of that. Joel, am I correct by saying that inevitably, as you increase the franchise, as you try to get more and more people to vote by mail, to vote in other ways, as you begin to allow people who may be on the margins of whether they're eligible or not eligible to vote, as you increase the franchise, isn't it inevitable that you're going to get more mistakes, more fraud? In the old days when only white, male, Protestant people could vote, landowners, there was probably very little fraud because, in the early elections in our history, 100,000 people voted, even though we had a population of 10 or 13 to 13 million. As we expand the franchise, don't you think it's inevitable that we're going to get more mistakes in the election?
Well, actually, I think there has been historically, and talking here in terms of decades and even centuries, historically there have been fewer mistakes as we've expanded the franchise. And that's for some specific reasons. When we started elections in this country, this might shock people to realize, but we didn't have a secret ballot. When you voted, you went somewhere and you announced who you were voting for out loud. You didn't have a secret ballot. You didn't put a piece of paper into a box, fold it over so no one could see what you really wanted to do. And it was in a disputed election very similar to this one. I believe it was the 1888 election with Grover Cleveland being ousted by Benjamin Harrison, where party operatives had basically printed ballots in Indiana, which was Harrison's home state. And there was so much fraud that went on among the Republicans, so it was the Republicans manufacturing all these votes for Harrison, that in the following few years, many states across the Union adopted the secret ballot. The secret ballot became the standard partly as a result of that. And of course, we were expanding the franchise at the same time. Now, black Americans were having trouble keeping their right to vote at that time in the South, and women did not have the right to vote yet. But in general, we've adopted practices that protect the integrity and the secrecy of the ballot over time as we've expanded the franchise.
Well, that's fascinating. I always tell you on my show, when I used to leave a class, I would say, it was a good class, I learned something from my students. I've now learned from my former student. I thought the opposite was true, and now you've persuaded me. I'm wrong, you're right. I will never again make the argument that expanding the franchise inevitably results in a more fraudulent or mistaken voting. You're persuasive.
Well, it could be that we are seeing more fraud with some of the new expansions. Vote by mail, for example, is really almost unknown outside the United States. There are a couple of countries that allow absentee ballots. Australia has allowed it for more than 100 years. But nobody has vote by mail to the extent that we used it in this election. Israel and South Korea both had major national elections during the pandemic, and they both required people to vote in person. In fact, in Israel, they don't even have absentee voting for people who live overseas. So if you wanted to vote, you had to fly back to Israel.
Wow. What percentage of Israelis voted in the last election? Of course, the last election was much like this election. It was a referendum on Netanyahu, love him or hate him. The way this election was a referendum on Trump, love him or hate him. People didn't vote for Biden as much as they voted against Trump, and vice versa. Same thing, I think, with Clinton. People voted against Hillary Clinton and against Donald Trump. Same thing with Netanyahu. But what percentage of Israelis, do you have any idea, voted in this election?
I think it was around 70%. It was the highest turnout since 1999.
Okay, that's pretty good. So let's get to YouTube for a second. What do you think, as somebody who cares deeply about free speech culture? You know, Google is not currently bound by the First Amendment. They get the benefit of a statute of Section 230, which immunizes them from generally any lawsuits because they're supposed to be just a platform. When that statute was passed, there was no idea that these platforms would become publishers and censor and editorialize and make judgments and decide what's true and what's false. What do you think of Google's announcement that it will remove from Wednesday on any items that mislead people by alleging that widespread fraud or errors change the outcome of the 2020 election?
Well, this continues the practice that Google and YouTube have had, and I devote an entire chapter to it in Neither Free Nor Fair. They've had this practice for the last few years of manipulating algorithms and deplatforming people to affect public discourse. And it happened to us at Breitbart, where Google changed their search engine to cut off searches to Breitbart. We're still doing very well because we have other ways of getting traffic, but we are not the only ones. They also took out some other conservative news websites for no particular reason other than their agenda. We actually did an expose where we showed a video of Google executives speaking openly about how they wanted to make sure Trump couldn't possibly win the 2020 election. So it was, we believe, in furtherance of that agenda. But on YouTube, they also started deplatforming people, and it starts with the easy cases, right? It starts with people like Alex Jones, for example, who's a right-wing commentator regarded by many as a conspiracy theorist, and he got himself into legal trouble by saying that the Sandy Hook shootings were a hoax and so forth. So people can look at that case and say, oh, well, you know, I guess maybe you don't want someone like that spreading misinformation, so you can take him off of YouTube. But it never ends there.
Of course not.
Because then they started demonetizing political speech, and not just on the right. They started demonetizing videos on the right and the left. There were people on the left complaining that if they mentioned certain words in their broadcasts, YouTube would not allow them to place ads on their videos.
Mm-hmm. Well, you may remember that I did a speech for a website about the history of Israel, about how it was established by the pen, by legal proceedings, the Balfour Declaration, UN declarations, League of Nations declarations, and then had to defend itself by the sword. And they said that was inappropriate for young people and marked it in a certain way, even though there was nothing controversial about it. And when I complained, they said, well, no human being made that decision. There were certain words, Palestine, that invoked the algorithm, and you got put in a category, and now there's a lawsuit pending against them. So Joel, let's put the challenge forward. Whether you believe it or not, and it's not important, do you think it's plausible? Do you think it's plausible that widespread errors may have changed the outcome of the 2020 election?
Yes, I do, and for a very specific reason, which is that in this election we saw the introduction of a new voting system, vote by mail, in many places that had never used it before. And in the primary elections in 2020, where this was first tested in Nevada, in New York, in other places, there was a rejection rate of about 1 in 4 ballots. About
Wow.
1 in 4 ballots was rejected. By the way, that's not me saying that. That's the Washington Post. The Washington Post did a story earlier in the election saying that about 1 in 4 ballots had been rejected in key battleground states, and that was going to create all kinds of problems in the November election. So this was something everybody saw coming. I mean, I say that voter fraud could have played a role, but more likely you would see what happened in the open playing an even bigger role, because this adoption of a new system that the states were not ready to handle, and by the way, a system desired by Democrats but fervently rejected by Republicans. I mean, that's also another element of this, that it was a system-wide change that was desired by one party and rejected by the other. That is why a lot of Republicans feel that this was cheating, that it was rigged against them, because they really didn't want to have an election this way. And as I like to put it, Republicans turned out voters. There was a huge Republican turnout, but Democrats turned out envelopes. And it just turned out that there were more envelopes than voters.
Well, there could have been voters who voted through envelopes, and that's obviously something that should be looked into. I'm not necessarily agreeing with you that this election was changed by fraudulent or erroneous ballots, but I think that it's fair for people to believe it, and if they believe it, to say it. Joel, how many millions of people do you think would agree with the statement that widespread fraud or errors changed the outcome of the 2020 election? Put an estimate on it. What do you think?
It's roughly half of Americans who are eligible to vote who believe that. We've seen several opinion surveys already saying it's about 47 or so percent. Just under 50% believe the election was stolen in that fashion. So I guess if you add up the universe of eligible registered voters or even likely voters, you're talking about 70 or 80 million Americans who believe that. Now, I'm going to say something else that might be interesting or shocking, which is in my book, Neither Free Nor Fair, I say that it's almost certain there was some amount of voter fraud on both sides, that there were probably some Republicans who also committed voter fraud. Because both sides believed this was an election that was going to determine the country, and they also believed there was a low probability of being caught because it's much harder to catch fraud with vote by mail. You know, a lot of people were getting extra ballots in the mail. Who was going to check if their Aunt Susan really lived at that address anymore? You know, so people had incentives to cheat, and so we haven't really found the big accusations about Republicans, but I'm sure that some of that went on. But yes, there's a huge proportion of the electorate. Let's say close to 100 million people in the ballpark who believe that the election was stolen. Now, that doesn't mean it was actually stolen, but a lot of people believe that it was or may have been.
Well, 100 million is an awful lot of people. My son, Elon, who is producing this show with me, just showed me a headline that 8,000 channels have been taken down from YouTube over this election claim. Talk about disenfranchising Americans, denying them the right to express a view on an extraordinarily influential platform like Google YouTube is remarkable. And so, YouTube, here's my message to you. You've just heard an extremely distinguished journalist, a man who has enormous credibility, a man who has enormous influence over tens of millions of Americans who reasonably believe him. You've just heard him fit the criteria that you have set out for taking down channels. He has alleged, not in direct dramatic terms, but he certainly has alleged that there is a substantial possibility that this election may have been influenced, determined, the outcome changed by errors, by systemic errors, by the ability to vote by mail. Is it true or isn't it true? That's for Americans to debate. So, YouTube, I challenge you, take down this show. I challenge you, take down this channel. I challenge you, do not allow Joel Pollak to express his views on my show. And if you do, there will be a response. There will be a response because you will have lost your exemptions under Section 230. You are no longer, at that point, a platform. You are making editorial judgments. Why are you being treated more favorably than the New York Times or the Washington Post or Breitbart? Why do you get an exemption if you're making these kinds of decisions? So let me tell you what the implications of this are, and I'd be interested in your views. So there are many channels on YouTube that assert categorically, without a doubt, that Israel is an apartheid country that engages in genocide. Those statements are flatly false. They are much more false than statements about this election. But you're not taking those down. And by not taking those down, when you take down the election allegations, what you're doing is you're certifying to listeners and viewers that you believe the allegations about genocide and apartheid against Israel are correct. Because if you believe they were false, you take them down. Why would you leave up an allegation of genocide and apartheid against Israel and take down a disputed claim about an election? So by taking down certain arguments and allegations and keeping others up, you are sending a message that you are certifying the truth of the ones you keep up and the falsity of those you take down. Joel, what do you think about that argument?
I think it's absolutely true. I think that they have long since proven themselves to be publishers and not platforms. And the same is true of Twitter and Facebook. The news today and yesterday that Hunter Biden is under investigation for financial crimes. We don't know the full extent of the investigation, but that news confirms the legitimacy of the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop and his emails. But that was suppressed by the major tech platforms. Another thing that happened, and you were involved in this case, the tech companies suppressed the name of the alleged whistleblower in the impeachment drama. We had the country brought to its knees, essentially, by an accusation by someone we weren't allowed to name. If you put the person's name in a headline or in an article, the social media companies would block that article or would take it down or slow its distribution. So we have, over and over again, and increasingly, YouTube, Google, Facebook, Twitter, these other companies interfering in political debates and yet claiming exemption under Section 230.
Of course, the idea of naming a whistleblower has some legal implications. There are statutes protecting the identity of whistleblowers. They don't carry criminal penalties, but I can understand a platform having explicit criteria saying we will not break the law. We will not allow child pornography on our platform. We will not allow the exposure in the name of whistleblowers. I can imagine that. Maybe you can argue against that. You can say whistleblowers don't have, obviously, the same level of protection. So I'm not suggesting that any decision to block a video which was illegal would violate the implications of Section 230. But when you stop a debate about an election, I mean, would they have canceled my book about the 2000 election? I doubt it. Now, I think one area where we may disagree, Joel, is I don't believe that Google, Facebook, Twitter are motivated, consciously at least, by partisan political ideology. I don't think they're consciously trying to help the Democrats or liberals and hurt Republicans and conservatives. I think they're much more concerned about their own credibility, their ability to earn money, their viability. But the effect has been one-sided, if not the intention. What do you think, Joel?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of evidence that they do have a political agenda.
Who's they? What do you mean they? How do you talk about a they when you talk about YouTube or Facebook? Facebook may be a little easier because you have a person, a face of Facebook,
right?
Zuckerberg. The others are a little harder. We don't know. I don't know the Twitter guy. I've seen him on television, and I don't know who controls Google or YouTube. I know some of the people who work for it. They're decent and nice people, but who's the they?
Well, in the case of Google, it's the senior executive staff of the company, and there was a video that was leaked to us of one of their company-wide meetings where they were talking about the presidential election right after it happened in 2016, and they were all lamenting the result and talking about how terrible it was and how they were going to make sure it never happened again. And not one of them thought that there might be someone with a different point of view in the room, and obviously there was because someone got the video to us and we published it. And so I think there are examples like that. Now,
aren't there counter examples too? I'm told that the guy who makes these decisions for Facebook is a conservative Republican. I don't know whether that's true, but I've read it. I can't imagine that companies that hire people based on these incredibly difficult IQ tests would be able really to decide that they only want liberals, progressives, Democrats. Inevitably, if you're going to have an IQ test basically for hiring, you're going to get people from every political side of the spectrum, right?
Yes, and I actually know one or two conservatives who work at Facebook. Facebook is a little bit different, and if you had to explain it in a very short-term way, I would just say that they've got Peter Thiel on their board. I mean, Peter Thiel is one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley and also a very outspoken libertarian. He was a Trump supporter in 2016. He spoke at the Republican National Convention.
I remember. Yeah.
So I think he's probably impressed on Facebook's senior leadership, the idea that you can't be a monoculture. And interestingly, Facebook is now under extreme pressure from the left to do more censorship of conservatives. They've kicked a bunch of people off their platform in controversial circumstances, but the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, is part of a left-wing push to get Facebook to kick even more people off the platform, which I find rather infuriating, because the ADL made its name, of course, as a civil rights organization, but now essentially they're advocating for limits to free speech, and not just for hate groups, but for groups like me. I mean, one of the targets is Breitbart News. They shouldn't have Breitbart as a news source on Facebook.
But don't you think
so
if you
out there,
go ahead, if you applied to Google for a job, you have an extraordinarily high IQ, you would probably pass their test with flying colors. They would probably hire you, wouldn't you? I'm talking about a younger Joel, right out of law school. If you had applied and to work at Google, they wouldn't have asked you for your political views. They probably would have hired you on Google or YouTube, wouldn't they?
Well, unfortunately, we just have so many cases of people who are either not being hired or who are being fired. I mean, the famous case with Google is James Damore, who is an engineer who voiced the opinion that some of the company's affirmative action policies were misguided, and he wasn't saying anything racist or sexist. He was just making an argument with the company, and he was fired. And now that's led to a lawsuit, and he's being represented by Harmeet Dillon. But that case energized a lot of the quiet, closeted conservatives in Silicon Valley who felt that they had to hide their politics to get a job, and that they can't speak out about what their real views are, or they place themselves at risk.
Well, now we're going to see even more, because we're seeing this new McCarthyism manifested in colleges like Georgetown, particularly, and Harvard. At Harvard, students circulated McCarthyite demands that anybody who supported Trump or worked for Trump or defended Trump, as I did in the front of the Senate, can't speak at Harvard or at Georgetown unless they go through a kind of truth camp program where we hit our heart and admit that we sinned, and go through a Chinese or a South African apartheid type moral renewal program, and maybe then we will get permission to speak and apologize for our sins. But if I wanted to go to Harvard and espouse my belief that Donald Trump should win the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way, this morning's news is that Donald Trump announced that Morocco has now normalized relations with Israel. I was invited to meet the King of Morocco some years ago by Bill Clinton when he was the president at a State Department dinner. And Morocco has always had kind of implicit relations, commercial and others, with Israel, but now to announce publicly a normalization, the idea, I would be very proud to go to Harvard and Georgetown and make the case for why President Donald Trump deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. You think any major American university would invite me to make that speech? And forget about me. They're denying students the right to hear two sides of an interesting and debatable issue. And if Donald Trump were ever to get the Nobel Peace Prize, people would be shocked because they never heard the case for him getting it. It's a little bit like the O.J. Simpson case. I hate to make comparisons there, but the data showed that people who watched the O.J. Simpson case on television weren't surprised at the verdict, but people who just read media accounts of what happened at the trial were shocked because they didn't understand that there were conflicts in the evidence, etc. So the idea that I would be banned, you would be banned today from Harvard, where I taught for 50 years, and you were a distinguished student for how many, 7 years? How many years were you at Harvard?
That's 7 altogether.
Yeah. That we would be banned today because of what you have said and what I have done is just shocking to American values. And what's happened to the culture of the First Amendment, the culture of freedom. Forget about the legal basis, the culture of freedom. So, Joel, you and I, we're going to prepare to challenge any media platform that imposes censorship on views that we think are important for the American public to hear. Are you in this with me, Joel?
Absolutely. And, you should do another show about the Sixth Amendment, because there's been an incredible amount of pressure on Trump's lawyers. There are calls for them to be disbarred, and there have been threats against his legal team for representing him.
Oh, I get threats. I get threats every day on my email for something I did 9 months ago. But remember, this did not begin with Donald Trump. It began with Ron Sullivan at Harvard being fired from the deanship because he briefly represented Harvey Weinstein. I have said that now it's 70 years of academia, 60 in higher education, more than 50 as a professor at Harvard. Other than McCarthyism, I have never seen a worse violation of academic freedom than the firing of Ron Sullivan. But our mutual colleague, Noah Feldman, has said, "Whoa, no, he wasn't fired. You don't understand. He wasn't fired. He just wasn't renewed." And so I wrote to Noah and I said, would you say the same thing if they discovered that a master or a dean of a college was gay and didn't renew him, or was secretly Muslim and didn't renew him, or in the 1930s was Jewish and didn't renew him, or had been a communist in the 1920s and didn't renew him? Are you really going to stand on the distinction between not being renewed and not being fired? Well, Noah hasn't responded to my email asking him for what his views on that are. But people, Noah Feldman, Larry Tribe, they're prepared to find rationalizations for anything that supports their partisan and ideological views. Tribe much worse than Feldman. But, our students are being so miseducated today by ideologues who will not even allow them to understand these arguments. Take, for example, what's going on now with the Texas lawsuits. Tribe called them, stupid and ridiculous. I guarantee you one thing. If the shoe were on the other foot, and if Biden had lost in the way that Trump lost, Tribe would be leading the effort to have a state sue another state. He would be taking this argument and arguing it himself. He has proved that over the years. When Bill Clinton was the president, he said, oh no, a sitting president can't be prosecuted or indicted. And then when Trump became president, whoops, I changed my mind.
Negative.
Tribe just doesn't pass the shoe on the other foot test. He has one shoe and one foot, and it's Democrat, it's progressive, it's left, and if anything suits that, he's going to come up with a constitutional argument for it. And if it doesn't, he's going to call the argument stupid without really responding on the merits. It's such a tragedy what's happened to Larry Tribe, who almost could have been on the United States Supreme Court. I actually pushed for him to become Solicitor General under Bill Clinton, and I'm very, very thankful that he was never appointed to the Supreme Court, because if he was, he would turn that institution even more ideological than it's become. Sorry to be ranting about somebody you and I both know, but Joel, what do you think?
Well, it surprised me when Larry Tribe became so partisan, because when I was a student in his class, I had that famous argument with Barney Frank, prominent Democrat, and he came to Harvard, and I challenged him, and we had an argument for a few minutes that actually made local news. And I got a very nice note from Larry Tribe saying he liked the way that I engaged Barney Frank. Maybe he had a personal difference with Barney Frank. I don't know. But I took it at the time to mean we need to see more challenges. We need to see more debate. We need to see more openness. I think that the Trump era distorted a lot of things for many Democrats who just couldn't fathom that Trump could have won the election. In my book, I talk about many reasons Trump could have lost the 2020 election.
Sure.
And I think there are some rational explanations that don't involve voter fraud or vote by mail or anything like that. I just point out in neither free nor fair that we can't rule out the possibilities of all these other kinds of abuse, especially when we see the censorship on social media and we see the one-sidedness of media coverage and so many other things. I mean, political violence. We've never had so much political violence since the late 1960s anyway, in this country affecting an election year. And that certainly played a role because Trump supporters were afraid, physically afraid, to say who they were voting for. That's not an environment conducive to a free and fair election.
No, I agree with you. Look, I was involved in those late 60s violent cases, not as a person committing violence, but I, of course, defended the Chicago 7, the lawyer, Bill Kunstler. I wrote the appeal that got his contempt proceeding thrown out, and I was involved as a consultant on the trial of the Chicago 7 and was very, very much involved in defending the actions of protesters during 1968 and into the early 1970s. And I agree with your assessment. I think the violence there was slightly greater. But I have to tell you, the ability to converse with people on the other side. I had friends who favored the Vietnam War. I had friends who went and served with honor and distinction. And we could talk. We could argue and we could have a conversation. Not today. I'm on Martha's Vineyard, and it's so easy for me to socially isolate here because nobody wants to talk to me. And if you've noticed, I've lost 15 pounds. I call it Donald Trump diet because nobody invites me to dinner anymore. You cannot have a conversation. I've had old friends who I've known for years, whose children I helped get into college, whose fathers I helped when they were criminally investigated, whose kids I defended when they were picked up for drunken driving, writing to me letters saying, I cannot be in the same society as you anymore. We cannot socialize because of views that you've expressed. And my wife was working out in a gym, and somebody pointed her out as my wife, and a woman stood up and yelled and said, I cannot be in the same gym as Alan Dershowitz's wife, and stamped out because I had defended the president against charges of unconstitutional impeachment. Joel, it's a good thing you're not around. If people saw me with you and knew that you were my friend, boy, I'd be in real trouble because Breitbart, my God, how can you hang around with people from Breitbart? Well, I do, and I will, and I'll continue to. And I'm going to look at Breitbart for a source of information, not the only source of information, but a source of information, because I want to get the most diverse sources of information, and that's why I wanted Joel on my show. I want him to express his heartfelt, intellectually serious view about this election. And Google, YouTube, if you don't like it, take it down, and we'll see you in court. So thank you, Joel, for being on this show. Thank you for helping educate my viewers and listeners. And I'd love to hear from the viewers and listeners. What's your view? What's your take on Joel's analysis? What's your take on YouTube? What's your take on the state of free speech in the United States? So, Joel, thank you. Everybody, please read his book, Not Free or Fair. Neither Free Nor Fair. I'm going to get it right. Neither Free Nor Fair, the 2020 election. Get it on Kindle. Read it. And call me about it when you've read it. I want to hear your views about it, and I want to hear your views about censorship in America. So we'll move on now to questions and comments from our wonderful viewers. Joel, it's called the Dershow, and I say the only thing that's lacking is the wits. And the wits are provided by my guests like you and by our callers. So, Joel, with great appreciation, continue to educate America. Let's turn now to our questions. Before we turn to our callers, let me give you a brief, sad update on the Brandon Bernard case. I have been working my head off literally almost 24/7 trying to stop the execution of a man who I believe may be legally innocent of a capital crime, though what he did was obviously awful and terrible. But he's now scheduled for execution at 6 o'clock on Thursday, and there is every reason to believe the execution will go forward. Legal remedies have not succeeded, nor have attempts to get commutation succeeded. So for me, it's a very sad day. Some of you may disagree with that, and I'll give you an update on the next show as to what has actually happened. But I'm expecting bad news. So let's turn to our calls now.
Hello, Mr. Dershowitz. My name is John, and I am from New York. In regard to Brandon Bernard, I listened twice, and there was no mention of the victims' names. Please say the names, Todd and Stacy Bagley. I wonder if the information you received and passed on is accurate. Brandon owned the .40 caliber Glock and gave it to Bialva. Brandon drove and bought 2 cans of lighter fluid. Brandon poured the lighter fluid on the car while Todd and Stacy were still alive, locked in the trunk and audibly praying. Todd and Stacy were each shot once by Bialva, Stacy in the face. Tom Mary Jo Buttafuoco, she should have been left for dead, Burns alive. Todd and Stacy had a few hours to make peace with their maker. Brandon has had 22 years to do so. Let's not make this another Trump is a bad guy, because he didn't pardon this man. Thank you.
Look, I'm not accusing anybody of being bad or anything else. This is a complicated and very difficult case. I have made a suggestion, but it hasn't been picked up. Stacy Bagley's name should be remembered and should be memorialized. I have proposed, in fact, that a foundation be established in her name to try to prevent other young people like her from being killed by gangs. And what I proposed is allowing young men who are now on death row to remain alive and to participate by Zoom and by Skype in an effort to educate young people not to join gangs and not to do things like this. This young man on death row has spent the last 22 years trying to persuade young people in prison to quit their gangs and not to do what he did. And so I think we can turn Stacy Bagley's death into something positive and life-saving rather than just using it as an opportunity to take the life of a 40-year-old man who has been rehabilitated and reformed. I understand the arguments on the other side, and I don't condemn people who disagree with my argument, but I think my argument is one that should be heard, and it has been heard, but it hasn't brought about the result that I had hoped for. So thank you for your call. Okay, our final call for today is from Michael in Virginia.
Hi, my name is Michael Wilner. I live in Virginia. And my question is this. Are you saying that even if it were true that China forced Dominion voting systems to rig the election and Biden didn't really win, there's nothing to be done? What if a National Integrity Commission is not established and China, through Dominion, rigs the next presidential election and the next, and so on? Thank you for answering my question.
It's a great question. No, of course I agree with you. If it could be proved that China or anybody else rigged the election and turned it around and turned voters who had voted for Trump to Biden voters, of course we should do something about it. And I think the Supreme Court would have to figure out what the appropriate remedy was. If there were a massive, undisputed evidence of massive fraud, it's conceivable there could be a new election. How the Constitution would deal with that, with its January 20th change of office and end of the presidency, is very difficult to see. But the issue should be debated. The issue should be discussed. Nobody should be silenced. According to Google YouTube now, this last caller, if he had his own channel on YouTube, it would be taken down because he has made statements and arguments that are inconsistent with YouTube and Google's policies. So my challenge stands. Google YouTube, if you want to take me down. But I'm not going to simply accept that. I'll fight back. But if you want to take me down because I had a guest on my show and I propose to have more guests on my show who make assertions that you think are false, you're not the final judge of truth or falsity. In America, we believe in the marketplace of ideas, the open marketplace of ideas, where people get to hear all arguments and get to decide for themselves. The government doesn't tell us what's true, and Google YouTube shouldn't tell us what's true. Because when you tell us what's false, then you're suggesting that what you don't take down is true. You don't want to be in that position of certifying all the falsehoods that are constantly being circulated in social media today. So the best answer is keep the marketplace of ideas open. The marketplace of ideas is open on the Dershow. Let's see if YouTube shuts it down. If you do, I will fight back, because my listeners want to hear what I have to say and what my guests have to say on The Dershow. Please call 24/7. The number is 216-710-0050. Keep your comments short and to the point. Again, the number for you to call 24/7 is 216-710-0050. Hard questions, criticisms, everything's fine. Just keep your questions short, and I'll answer them all on The Dershow.